I'm Jody Sanders with American Patchwork and Quilting. Today's video is being brought to you by Baby Lock. Do you like to sew with small pieces? I love making mini quilts and sewing on a small scale. And today I want to give you a couple of tips and show you some tools that I like to use to make small and mini quilts. When picking out your fabric to work on a small or mini quilt, you're going to want to find a motif that's on the smaller side or small scale, or a tone on tone. Those work best because if you use a large scale print, when you cut it up into those small pieces, you lose the color and you lose the detail of the print and the motif itself. So you'll want to find something that has a smaller scale, and also something probably that doesn't have a lot of color. If you have a lot of color changes, again, when you cut it up into smaller pieces, you're not going to be able to see that level of detail. Once you've picked out your fabrics, then it's time to get your tools out so you can start cutting. Now, for some people, the 6 by 12 inch ruler is a pretty common ruler to have that you would use to do cutting. But when you're making smaller mini quilts, I would suggest getting smaller rulers that you can use. So like this is a 4.5 inch, we've got a small flying geese ruler, we've got a little 2.5 inch square, and that will help you when you're trying to cut those small pieces. So in addition to the rulers, you're also going to want to scale down your rotary cutter. There's two sizes here on the table. The 45mm is the larger one, and that's the one that most people probably have and use. There is also a 28mm, and that's the smaller one, and that's really nice for cutting small pieces. I'm going to set these aside. The next thing you might want to look at is getting a small mat. And this is really nice because in addition to just being smaller scale, you can easily set it by your sewing machine and do cutting there if you want. It also turns really easily on the table, so you can turn the mat to finish up your cutting. And then you don't have to worry about turning your pieces and maybe losing some accuracy. So these small mats are really nice. There's also a mat pressing combo. So this is actually really nice for working on small blocks. This side is for pressing, and then this side is for cutting. Now that you have everything cut, you're ready to start sewing. And here's a few tips when using your sewing machine. Number one, you might want to switch out to a 1/4 inch foot. That will help you with your accuracy. When you're making small quilts, it's really important to have a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you vary even a little bit, if you multiply that in the little pieces that you're making, it's really going to make a difference. So having that 1/4 inch seam allowance foot on there is really, really going to be helpful. The other thing you might want to do is put on the straight stitch throat plate. So in this case, you can see there's just one little dot up toward the top here. That means your needle is just going down that one small hole. Sometimes when we have small pieces and we're putting them through to sew, that fabric gets caught down in there and that can cause problems. So if you switch out to the straight stitch throat plate, you'll alleviate some of those problems that you might have. You also might want to shorten your stitch length just a little bit, not too much, but just enough so that when you're working with those small pieces, it catches them a little more often than it would if you have a little longer stitch length. And finally, if you don't have a stiletto, this is called an orange stick, and you can find it in the area of your drugstore that has like nail polish. It's actually used with manicures. It's got a little pointed end on it, and this is great for helping to guide through your fabrics as you're putting them through to sew. So now you've got your little quilt top all sewn together, and I want to give you a couple of tips for finishing your mini quilts. Number one, take a look at the batting that you'll be using. You want to use something probably thin, so something like a thin cotton, or even flannel works really well. You don't want to use like a high loft poly because it's just not going to look very good with those small mini quilts. Also think about your quilting design. You'll want to do something that's fairly simple and not too overwhelming. Putting a big feather wreath on this small quilt just wouldn't complement it very well. So having very simple lines, you can do some wavy lines. Just do something that accentuates that small quilt and doesn't detract from it. You also want to look at your binding. On small quilts, probably do a single fold binding instead of a double fold binding. That just lets it lay a little flatter. And in this case, in addition to the single fold binding, I've also made my binding, I've cut it a little narrower to start with. So I have a little narrower binding, which again fits the scale better of the little mini quilt. So I hope these tips and tools will help you when you get ready to do some of your own tiny sewing.